Let's have a closer look at a very special and interesting historical question today. Why did the Germans package their superchargers in cars and aeroplanes up to the 1940s 90 degree to the crankshaft, while everybody else did it parallel? It's a question that required lots of research and buying a couple of old German engineering books to untangle that part of history. The research took us back into the 1880s, right to the beginning of car engineering, and many famous names were involved. So let's get started. The initial question was why the Mercedes DB600 series, including 601, 603 and 605, and also the Junkers Jumo 210 series that was developed at the same time, had superchargers 90 degree to the crankshaft. Let's start in 1909, in the Kingdom of Austria and Hungary. It was early days of aviation and planes became more and more interesting for military use. The army practiced with all sorts of planes they could get, and the young Air Force demanded a modern aircraft engine from Austrian production for their troops. So they gave the project to Austro-Daimler, a company that was founded as the Austrian version of Daimler in Germany. Technical director at Austro-Daimler until 1907 was Paul Daimler, son of company founder Gottlieb Daimler. His successor as technical director was a young engineer called Ferdinand Porsche. His job now was to design a reliable, powerful, state-of-the-art aircraft engine, and for the very first time an engine that is designed for aircrafts only and not just a car engine modified to work in a plane. His design was the Austro-Daimler 6, an inline six-cylinder engine for minimum vibration and smallest frontal area, with a cast aluminium crankcase and 6 separate iron cylinders. It had an overhead camshaft and 4 hanging valves per cylinder. The hanging valves allowed them to have a higher compression ratio compared to the flathead engines. 4 valves per cylinder gave them a better flow. Also, the engine had a double ignition system. Having 2 spark plugs per cylinder is not just more reliable, it also helps to burn the air-fuel mixture faster and more efficiently. Interesting here is the position of the exhaust on the right-hand side and inlets on the left, which will become industry standard until today for longitudinally mounted engines. For cars, the side on which you would enter and drive a vehicle wasn't really defined at that time, but aeroplanes had 1 or 2 seats behind each other and were entered from the left-hand side, just like a horse, which was still very common in everyday life. So Porsche positioned the exhaust on the right, which also helped car design later on, when the steering became standard on the left-hand side of the vehicle. So carburetors and steering were always on the cold side of the engine bay. But back to the Austro 6. The overhead camshaft was driven by bevel gears and a so-called Königswelle or master shaft, a design that was introduced to car engines by the Nesselsdorf S4, a car designed by the famous Austrian designer Hans Lettwinker, who is later on the father of cars like the Tatra 77 and, together with Porsche, the Volkswagen Beetle. The Austro 6 from 1909 had 13.9 liter displacement, a weight of 260 kg, and was with only 65 horsepower pretty underpowered and not interesting for the Austrian troops. Porsche focused on reliability first and now improved performance. In 1912 it already had 100 horsepower and 120 horsepower in 1913. During the First World War, the power output could be increased to over 200 horsepower, and the Austro 6 became the role model for a modern, powerful and reliable aircraft engine. Other engine manufacturers basically threw away their old designs and copied the Austro 6. 2 of them were Mercedes with their new D3 engine and the newly formed company BMW that based all future hopes on this straight 6-cylinder engine, a design that became characteristic for BMWs until today. In the later years of the First World War, fighter planes became more powerful and were flying in higher altitudes. The problem with this is that the higher you fly, the lower is the air density. If air is less dense, you have less oxygen to burn fuel and lose power. Conquering this problem became the main task for engine manufacturers from 1916 onwards. The BMW engine was very popular because it had a higher compression ratio and was losing less power in high altitudes. At Mercedes, technical director Paul Daimler had a different approach. He remembered the work of his father Gottlieb Daimler when he was working for Nikolaus Otto, inventor of the four-stroke principle, in Cologne in the 1880s. While his boss Nikolaus Otto was focusing on the four-stroke principle, Daimler was already working on increasing power with supercharging. But instead of using an external component for it, his concept was to use the downwards movement of the piston to compress air, before guiding it up to the combustion chamber, similar to a two-stroke engine. Now, in 1916, his son Paul Daimler remembered this and searched for a way to compress air into the combustion chamber to avoid power loss in high altitudes. The first prototypes had a so-called Wittich supercharger that was mounted parallel to the crankshaft underneath the engine, driven by a chain. But this arrangement increased frontal area a lot. A year later, in 1918, Daimler finished the first production-ready supercharged aircraft engine with 260 horsepower. But now they used a more compact Roots supercharger. It was still mounted underneath the engine and parallel to the crankshaft. Advantage of this engine was that, because it was supercharged, it had the same power output as at ground level without supercharger in up to 6,000 meter altitude with supercharger. But at this time they could only switch the supercharger off and on. So, perfect for controlling the power output of the engine would be a device that automatically controls the supercharger depending on the plane's altitude. We will come to this later. For the aircraft engines, superchargers could increase power by up to 50%. For Daimler's submarine engines, they could increase output by 100%. So, by the end of the war, there was a lot of knowledge at Daimler about supercharged engines. Because of the contract of Versailles, Germany wasn't allowed to build military crafts like submarines anymore, and also no motorized planes, only gliders. So Paul Daimler took this knowledge and applied it to their car engines now. In 1921, they had 5 prototypes of supercharged cars. 4 of them had a root supercharger parallel to the crankshaft and on the right-hand side of the vehicle. These old generation car engines still had the inlet on the right side of the engine because Daimler only built cars with the steering on the right side at the time. One of the 5 prototypes had the supercharger vertically mounted in front of the engine. Since there was already a lot of experience with 90-degree bevel gears from the master shaft that drives the camshafts, and by the way they also used them to drive the ignition, they decided to go with the more elegant package of the vertically mounted superchargers and used bevel gears to drive it. A long engine was not an issue for cars of that time. Bevel gears have worse efficiency than normal gear pairings, but the package advantages outweighed the disadvantages. In 1922, after internal arguments, Paul Daimler left the company founded by his father and became technical director at Horch. There, he used his experience with inline 8-cylinder engines to create the famous Horch 8 series, one of the most popular luxury cars of that time. His successor at Mercedes was, again, just like 17 years before, Ferdinand Porsche. He developed the supercharged vehicles further, improved their power and drivability, but kept the same package. That was the creation of the famous and very successful Mercedes SS, SSK and SSKL sports cars. These still had inline 6-cylinder engines with master shaft and a root supercharger vertically mounted in front of the engine. While Mercedes was interested in a tidy, reliable package and a car that doesn't look supercharged, but simply offers superior performance, Bentley created at the same time a very simple package and bolted a large supercharger to the front of the crankshaft. The root supercharger is completely visible, and that also meant that the carburetors were sitting outside now. That was the birth of the famous blower Bentley. The Mercedes SSK sports car design, on the other hand, was the basis for the dominating Mercedes Grand Prix cars of the 1930s. They used the same supercharged concept, but as an inline 8-cylinder engine. Porsche left Mercedes at the end of the 1920s and founded his own design office. The first bigger project was to design the Grand Prix competitor to the Mercedes, the Auto Union Type A. Instead of an inline 8-cylinder, he combined 2 of them to a V16 engine. The first versions on the test bench did not have a supercharger yet, but when the engine was installed in the car, it had a vertically mounted root supercharger behind the engine. Later on, in 1939, they even had 2 of them and both 90 degree to the crankshaft. If you're interested in more details on this, check out my other video in the description. So, the Germans loved their bevel gears because they are reliable and created packaging advantages. So, in the early 1930s, when Mercedes got the task to design a modern aircraft engine for future fighter planes, they remembered their experience from the First World War and took two inline 6-cylinders and combined them to a V12. This one had hanging cylinders, which made it a so-called A engine. More on this in my other video. And this new DB600 engine was also supercharged. But instead of using the roots concept, they now changed to a single radial supercharger, which offered more potential. And also here, again, they positioned it 90 degrees to the crankshaft. The previous experiences with this packaging gave them good confidence in this concept, and this offered some packaging advantages again. One advantage is aerodynamics. While Allied aircraft engines had the radial supercharger at the back of the engine, that meant that airflow needed to turn 180 degrees from intake to supercharger. Behind the supercharger, the flow needed to turn 90 degrees again to reach the plenum. The Mercedes design, on the other hand, only had a 90-degree turn to the supercharger and a straight outlet towards the plenum. So, in summary, they saved 180-degree turn only in the intake. The other advantage was that because of that packaging, they had enough space to design a clutch mechanism that was controlling the supercharger based on altitude, something they had wished for during the First World War. Initially, because of this clever automatic control system, the power output did not change up until 4,500 meter altitude, and later they could improve this to more than 7,000 meter. Also, they could increase the diameter of the supercharger without increasing the plane's frontal area. So, the history of German supercharging is long, and lots of different concepts have been designed and tested in planes and cars. Although bevel gears are not the most efficient solution if you look at gear pairings only, they do allow a package that can offer far more advantages. The fact that we can see this design in the sports cars of the 1920s, the dominating Grand Prix cars of the 1930s, and at the most popular aircraft engines of the Second World War shows that the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. I hope you enjoyed these insights into some technical history, and see you at the next video.